1 million people, trapped behind walls, starving, dying, fighting to the death for their God. In 70 AD, the Roman Empire faced its greatest challenge in the east when Jerusalem erupted in total revolt. For 4 years, Jewish rebels defied the world's mightiest military machine, turning their holy city into an impregnable fortress of faith. But when Titus arrived with 4 legions, the siege that followed became hell on earth. Mothers ate their children, streets flowed with blood, and when the temple finally burned, 6 centuries of Jewish worship died in a single day. This wasn't just conquest, it was the destruction of an entire civilization. Today, you'll witness the most catastrophic siege in ancient history. The sacred stones of Jerusalem had witnessed the rise and fall of kings for 1,000 years, but none had prepared them for the weight of Rome's sandals marching through David's city. In the 6th year of the Common Era, when Augustus Caesar ruled the world from his marble throne, and Jewish hearts still burned with memories of the Maccabees, the last pretense of independence crumbled like ancient mortar beneath the hammer of imperial necessity. Archelaus, that weak-willed son of a cunning father, had proven himself unworthy of the crown Herod had left him, and Rome's patience, never abundant where fractious provinces were concerned, had finally reached its end. Archelaus ruled with neither his father's wisdom nor his restraint. Where the great king had balanced Roman demands against Jewish sensibilities with the skill of a master juggler, his son trampled both underfoot with equal contempt. Complaints flowed like winter torrents toward Rome, from Jews outraged by his cruelties, from Roman officials disgusted by his incompetence, from Samaritans and Gentiles alike who found in him neither protector nor patron. When the inevitable summons came, calling him to account before Augustus himself, Archelaus departed the holy city with the confidence of one who believed royal blood could wash away any stain. He took ship at Caesarea while crowds gathered on the shore, not to bid farewell, but to witness what they prayed would be his final voyage from their land. Behind him lay a kingdom seething with resentments as numerous as the stones in Solomon's ancient walls. The imperial judgment fell swift as an executioner's blade. Augustus, that master of statecraft who had transformed republic into empire, through carefully measured steps, declared the Herodian experiment finished. No longer would Rome trust native princes to govern this turbulent province. Direct rule would replace the fiction of independence. Coponius arrived as the first procurator, his authority backed by Roman steel and Roman law, carrying with him a vision of order that would reshape the very soul of the Jewish people. Yet even as Roman standards unfurled from Jerusalem's towers, the true revolution began not with proclamations, but with the mundane business of Roman administration. Quirinius, governor of Syria, an architect of efficiency, descended upon Judea with scrolls and scribes, determined to accomplish what no conqueror had ever dared attempt: a complete accounting of Jewish souls and their possessions. The census struck at the very heart of Jewish belief, like lightning splitting sacred cedar. For generations, the children of Israel had lived by laws older than the empire itself, statutes that forbade any earthly ruler from numbering the people as if they were cattle in a field. When King David had succumbed to such pride, the Almighty's wrath had fallen upon the nation in plague that claimed 70,000 lives. Now officials with alien gods demanded what even Israel's greatest king had learned to regret, and the very stones seemed to cry out against this abomination. In the markets of Jerusalem, voices rose in heated debate as merchants abandoned their scales and farmers their plows to wrestle with questions that cut deeper than commerce or cultivation. How could faithful Jews submit to being counted like sheep when the Most High alone possessed the right to number his people? What manner of servitude was this? that treated free children of Abraham as mere property of Caesar. The arguments echoed through narrow streets and broad courtyards, growing more passionate with each retelling. From Galilee came a voice that would kindle flames still burning when Jerusalem's ashes had long grown cold. Judas of Galilee, called by some the Gaulonite, for his birthplace near the Jordan's headwaters, strode through the temple courts with the fierce authority of ancient prophets. His words fell upon receptive ears like sparks upon dry tinder, igniting passions that Roman swords could cut down but never entirely extinguish. No master but the Almighty. The cry began as whisper, but swelled to roar as crowds gathered around this lean, burning-eyed teacher who spoke truths that pierced souls like arrows. Shall the children of the covenant bow before pagan census takers? Shall we acknowledge Caesar as Lord over what belongs to the Lord of hosts alone? His teachings spread beyond mere resistance to taxation. They encompassed a complete theology of rebellion that would echo through decades of mounting tension. Judas proclaimed what he called the fourth philosophy, distinct from the Pharisees with their careful interpretations, the Sadducees with their priestly privileges, and the Essenes with their desert retreats. This new way demanded absolute allegiance to heaven's sovereignty, rejecting any earthly authority that competed with divine rule. Death before dishonor became more than mere slogan. It transformed into sacred principle that would drive men to acts of desperate courage and seemingly senseless sacrifice. The census proceeded despite protests and despite violence, Roman efficiency grinding forward like millstones crushing grain. Officials recorded names and counted property, while soldiers stood guard with hands resting on sword hilts. Yet even as scribes filled their rolls with neat columns of figures, everyone understood that something fundamental had changed. The accommodation that had allowed Jews to live under foreign rule while maintaining their essential identity had cracked like pottery dropped on stone. Those fractures spread through every level of Jewish society, with the persistence of water finding weakness in rock. In the temple, priests debated whether offering sacrifices for Caesar's health constituted collaboration with idolatry. In the synagogues, teachers argued over the proper response to ungodly demands from godless rulers. In homes throughout the land, fathers struggled to explain to their sons why submission to injustice might sometimes serve righteousness better than glorious rebellion. The theological implications cut deeper than political grievances or economic burdens. For centuries, Jews had maintained their distinct identity under foreign rule by carefully separating what belonged to Caesar from what belonged to the Almighty. Tribute could be paid, officials could be honored, laws could be obeyed, so long as the essential core of faith remained untouched. But the census violated that sacred boundary, treating the chosen people as mere subjects to be catalogued and assessed like any other conquered nation. Among the Pharisees, those meticulous interpreters of law and tradition, the debates raged with scholarly intensity but growing passion. Some argued that survival required accommodation, that preserving the community mattered more than abstract principles of sovereignty. Others insisted that certain lines could never be crossed without betraying everything their ancestors had died to preserve. The discussions that began in study houses soon spilled into streets and marketplaces. The Sadducees, those aristocratic families who controlled the temple and its vast wealth, faced their own agonizing choices. Their power depended upon Roman tolerance, their privileges upon imperial favor. Yet they too were children of Abraham, inheritors of promises that transcended political convenience. When Roman demands conflicted with Jewish law, which obligation took precedence? The question tormented consciences that had grown comfortable with compromise. From this theological foundation, arose what Romans would call the Sicari, the dagger men who struck down collaborators in crowded marketplaces before melting away like morning dew. Their victims were not foreign occupiers, but fellow Jews deemed guilty of betraying their people's sacred trust. Tax collectors who served Roman interests, priests who offered sacrifices for pagan rulers, merchants who profited from imperial favor, all became targets for knives consecrated to heaven's service. The violence begot violence in the endless cycle that would plague Judea for generations. Roman authorities responded to assassination with crucifixion, to rebellion with collective punishment, to resistance with increasingly harsh measures that drove more Jews toward desperate remedies. Each execution created martyrs whose deaths inspired fresh recruits to the cause of liberation. Pontius Pilate arrived as procurator with a reputation for efficiency and a mandate for order, but he brought with him an imperial officer's contempt for Hebrew sensibilities and a soldier's belief that force could solve any problem. His tenure would be marked by provocations that seemed calculated to inflame rather than pacify the restless population under his authority. The incident of the standards demonstrated how easily cultural misunderstanding could explode into crisis. When Pilate ordered military emblems bearing Caesar's image to be brought into the holy city by night, he violated Hebrew law as surely as if he had placed idols upon the sanctuary altar itself. The graven images that soldiers carried as marks of honor struck Israelite eyes as abominations worthy of any sacrifice to remove. Crowds gathered at the procurator's residence in Caesarea, not with weapons, but with prayers, demanding removal of the offensive standards. For 6 days they maintained their vigil, refusing food or shelter, willing to die rather than see their holy city defiled by pagan symbols. When Pilate finally ordered soldiers to surround the protesters with drawn swords, the Hebrews responded by baring their necks and declaring their readiness for martyrdom. The procurator's calculation proved wrong. These were not ordinary protesters who could be dispersed with threats of violence. Their determination revealed depths of religious conviction that imperial pragmatism struggled to comprehend. Faced with the choice between massacre and concession, Pilate chose retreat, ordering the offensive standards removed. Yet the victory came at a cost. It taught both sides lessons about the power of extremism that would echo through decades of mounting conflict. The aqueduct controversy revealed another facet of the deepening crisis. When Pilate appropriated sanctuary funds to finance improvements to the city's water supply, he believed he was acting for the public good, using sacred money for sacred purposes. Hebrew leaders saw instead the latest in a series of provocations designed to humiliate their people and profane their faith. The riots that followed claimed lives on both sides as soldiers, disguised in civilian clothes, moved through crowds of protesters with clubs and daggers. Blood flowed in streets that had witnessed David's triumphs and Solomon's glory, staining stones that had echoed with psalms of praise. The dead became martyrs in one narrative, rebels in another, but their bodies testified to an irreconcilable conflict between two visions of justice. Throughout Pilate's troubled tenure, the pattern repeated with depressing regularity. Imperial efficiency encountered Hebrew law. Caesar's pragmatism collided with religious principle. The logic of occupation met the passion of resistance. Each confrontation left deeper scars, harder hearts, fewer voices willing to speak for moderation and compromise. The brief restoration of native rule under Agrippa I offered tantalizing glimpses of what might have been achieved under different circumstances. This grandson of Herod the Great possessed his ancestors' political skills without his moral compromises, his charm without his cruelty. For 3 short years, Israelites glimpsed the possibility of governing themselves with dignity while maintaining friendship with the empire. Agrippa understood both worlds, the glittering sophistication of imperial courts and the ancient pieties of sanctuary worship. He could quote Greek philosophy with senators in the morning and discuss Talmudic law with Hebrew sages in the afternoon. His reign demonstrated that accommodation need not mean capitulation, that Israelite identity could flourish even under oversight when handled with wisdom and respect. But Agrippa's sudden death in 44 AD shattered these hopes like glass striking stone. The empire's decision to return Judea to direct procuratorial rule revealed its fundamental misunderstanding of Hebrew aspirations. What Israelites saw as temporary expedient, the capital viewed as permanent arrangement. What they hoped might evolve into genuine autonomy was intended to remain perpetual subordination. The series of procurators who followed brought varying degrees of competence and corruption to their impossible task, but none possessed the vision necessary to heal the deepening wounds between ruler and ruled. Some, like Felix, relied on brutal suppression of dissent. Others, like Festus, attempted honest administration within an inherently dishonest system. All discovered that governing Judea required more than good intentions or administrative skill. Felix's reign witnessed the emergence of organized resistance on a scale that dwarfed earlier sporadic violence. The Sicarii evolved from isolated assassins into coordinated networks capable of striking throughout the province. Their targets expanded beyond individual collaborators to include symbols of occupation, imperial officials, Greek merchants, anyone who profited from the regime's benefits while ignoring its costs. As tensions mounted through the 50s and early 60s, even minor incidents threatened to explode into major confrontations. A dispute over synagogue privileges in Caesarea became proxy war between Hebrew and Greek residents. Arguments about religious observance escalated into riots requiring military intervention. The normal frictions of urban life took on apocalyptic significance as communities already stretched to breaking point struggled with problems that would have been manageable under different circumstances. The procuratorship of Gessius Florus marked the final descent into chaos. This man, whose avarice exceeded even Felix's notorious corruption, seemed determined to provoke the very rebellion that more skillful administrators had worked to prevent. His theft from the sanctuary treasury provided the spark that would ignite decades of accumulated resentment into open warfare. When Florus demanded 17 talents from the Holy Treasury, ostensibly to cover imperial expenses, he struck at the heart of Hebrew religious autonomy. The sanctuary was not merely place of worship, but symbol of divine presence, repository of sacred trust, center of national identity. To rob its treasury was to commit sacrilege that demanded response from heaven itself. The protests that erupted in the sacred city's streets carried 60 years of grievances in their passionate fury. These were not ordinary riots over economic hardship or political disagreement, but expressions of spiritual anguish that had been building since the first imperial census. The crowds that confronted Florus bore witness to injustices that stretched back through generations of occupation. Yet even as the holy city burned with righteous anger, voices still called for restraint and reason. King Agrippa II, that last remnant of Herodian diplomacy, arrived to plead with his people for patience. His speech from the walls would be remembered as eloquent testimony to the costs of resistance and the benefits of accommodation, but its reception revealed how far beyond rational argument the situation had already moved. The sanctuary ceased its daily sacrifices for Caesar's welfare, that small ritual gesture that had symbolized Hebrew submission to imperial authority. In its place rose prayers for deliverance and hymns of resistance that echoed off ancient stones witness to so much history. The sound carried beyond the city's walls to every corner of the empire, announcing that the long accommodation between the children of Israel and their occupiers had finally reached its end. The storm that had been building since Archelaus fell from power 60 years before was about to break at last upon the holy city's devoted head. When it passed, nothing would remain of the world that had existed since Herod's time. The sanctuary would lie in ruins, the city would smoke with fire, and the chosen people would begin their long exile from the land their fathers had received from divine hands. The summer of 66 AD arrived in Judea like a fever that refused to break, each passing day bringing temperatures that seemed to mirror the heat building in Hebrew hearts throughout the province. In Caesarea, where Herod's marble colonnades caught the Mediterranean breeze, and Roman officials conducted their business in cool shade, the final act of a 60-year tragedy was about to unfold. What began as a simple dispute over ritual law would end with the eagles of the empire facing their most dangerous challenge since the Rhine legions had mutinied, and Jerusalem preparing for a siege that would echo through eternity. The trouble started, as so many catastrophes do, with something small and seemingly insignificant. In the mixed city of Caesarea, where Jews lived alongside Greeks and Syrians in an uneasy arrangement dating back to Herod's grand urban experiment, competing claims over a single synagogue would prove the match that lit the accumulated tinder of 6 decades. The building itself was unremarkable. Stone walls, wooden benches, a simple ark for the Torah scrolls, but its location adjacent to a Greek merchant's property had created the perfect conditions for conflict. For years, the synagogue's congregation had endured provocations that might have seemed petty to outside observers, but cut deep into the souls of men already raw from countless humiliations. Greek neighbors deliberately conducted their business loudly during prayers, drove carts past the entrance during services, and found excuses to block the narrow street that provided access to the building. Each incident was small enough to ignore, but together they formed a pattern of deliberate contempt that spoke to larger questions about Hebrew rights in their own land. The crisis reached its breaking point when a Greek landowner, emboldened by Floris's obvious indifference to Hebrew concerns, began construction that would completely block the synagogue's entrance. What had been passive aggression became active hostility as workers appeared with hammers and stones, building a wall that would make worship impossible. The symbolism was unmistakable. Israelites might be tolerated in this imperial city, but they would do so on terms set by their neighbors. Desperate pleas to the procurator met with calculated delay and transparent corruption. Floris agreed to hear the Hebrew petition, but demanded an enormous bribe for his attention, 8 talents of silver, a sum that would have fed 100 families for a year. Even when this extortion was paid, his judgment favored the Greeks, ruling that the synagogue could remain, but must accept the blocked entrance as legal construction. The decision struck the Hebrew community like a physical blow. Here was the law of the empire revealed in all its cynical nakedness. Justice belonged to whoever could pay the highest price, and the religious rights of Israelites counted for nothing when they conflicted with Greek commercial interests. Word of the ruling spread through Caesarea's Hebrew quarter like wildfire, carrying with it the bitter recognition that accommodation had finally reached its limits. On the following Sabbath, when Jews arrived to find their synagogue entrance completely sealed, something fundamental broke in the collective soul of the community. Young men who had counseled patience began sharpening knives. Elderly rabbis who had preached submission started quoting verses about divine vengeance, and women who had raised their children to respect imperial authority began teaching them songs of liberation that dated back to the Maccabees. The riot, when it came, erupted with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm. A Greek merchant made the mistake of conducting a pagan sacrifice directly in front of the blocked synagogue entrance, his offering to the gods a deliberate insult to the God of Israel. Hebrew onlookers, already at the breaking point from months of accumulated frustration, fell upon the offender with bare hands and improvised weapons. Within minutes, the narrow streets of Caesarea rang with war cries and the clash of bronze on bronze. What followed would have remained a local disturbance, quickly suppressed by Roman soldiers and forgotten by history, if not for Florus's calculated response to the crisis he had helped create. Instead of investigating the root causes or attempting to mediate between the communities, the procurator saw opportunity in chaos. Here was the excuse he needed to seize the temple treasury entire, justifying his theft as necessary funds to restore order in a rebellious province. The demand, when it came, shocked even those Jews who had grown accustomed to imperial avarice. 17 talents from the sacred funds, not a loan or a fine, but an outright confiscation, dressed up in legal language about provincial security. The sum represented generations of faithful offerings, coins dropped into collection boxes by pilgrims from throughout the diaspora, silver accumulated through centuries of devotion. To steal this money was to rob God himself. In Jerusalem, the news of Florus's demand struck like lightning in a powder magazine. The sanctuary courts, usually filled with the peaceful bustle of commerce and worship, exploded with angry voices as word spread through the crowds. Merchants abandoned their stalls, pilgrims forgot their prayers, and priests found themselves surrounded by mobs demanding immediate action against this ultimate sacrilege. Young men from the revolutionary parties that had grown in secret for decades suddenly found themselves with all the recruits they could handle. The Sicarii, those dagger men who had spent years operating in shadows, emerged into daylight to discover entire neighborhoods ready to support their cause. Even moderate Jews who had counseled patience found their voices drowned out by crowds chanting for war. The demonstration that gathered in the sacred courts on the following day represented something unprecedented in the long history of Hebrew resistance to the capital. Here were not just the usual radicals and malcontents, but ordinary citizens pushed beyond endurance by Florus's greed. Fathers held their sons' hands while explaining why submission to this particular injustice was impossible. Mothers pointed to the sanctuary walls, while teaching their daughters that some things were worth dying to defend. When Florus arrived in Jerusalem with a cohort of troops to collect his tribute, he found not the usual cowed population, but a city seething with righteous anger. His demand to meet with the sacred authorities was met with counter-demands that he return the stolen funds and apologize for his sacrilege. The confrontation that followed would destroy the last pretense of cooperation between imperial authority and Hebrew leadership. The procurator's response revealed the brutal calculation behind his seemingly erratic behavior. Rather than negotiate or compromise, he unleashed his soldiers on the crowds, ordering them to seize the equivalent of the temple funds from private citizens. What followed was not crowd control, but organized robbery, as legionaries broke into homes and businesses, taking whatever caught their fancy while claiming they were collecting taxes. The violence escalated when Jewish leaders demanded that Florus punish the soldiers responsible for the worst excesses. Instead of discipline, the procurator ordered public floggings and crucifixions of prominent Israelites, including some who held Roman citizenship and should have been immune from such degrading punishments. The message was unmistakable. Imperial law existed for the empire alone, while Hebrews could expect only such justice as force could provide. Among those arrested was Eleazar ben Ananias, son of a former high priest and captain of the Sacred Guard. His crime had been organizing the peaceful protests against the theft. His punishment a public beating that drew blood from one of Jerusalem's most respected families. As the whips fell across his back and the crowd watched in horrified silence, something irreplaceable died in the relationship between the capital and its Hebrew subjects. That night, as Eleazar lay bleeding in his cell, he made the decision that would transform local uprising into imperial crisis. The temple's sacrifices offered twice daily for the emperor's health and prosperity. That ancient ritual that symbolized Hebrew loyalty to the empire would cease the following dawn. In their place would be prayers for deliverance and hymns of resistance that would echo across the known world. The announcement, when it came, struck Roman and Jewish ears with very different meanings. To Florus and his officials, the cessation of sacrifices represented open rebellion that demanded immediate military response. To Israelites throughout Palestine and beyond, it meant that the long accommodation with imperial rule had finally ended, that the time for half measures and compromises had passed forever. Word of Jerusalem's defiance spread through the province with the speed of fire in dry grass. In Galilee, where memories of Judas the Galilean still burned bright, villages that had remained quiet for decades suddenly exploded into revolt. In Judea proper, the countryside filled with armed bands, striking at imperial installations and Hebrew collaborators with equal ferocity. Even in the diaspora communities scattered across the empire, synagogues buzzed with excited speculation about the coming deliverance. The rebels' first target was the Antonia fortress, that massive stronghold overlooking the sacred courts that had served as a visible reminder of imperial dominance for generations. Built by Herod to honor Mark Antony and maintained by his successors to overawe potential troublemakers, the fortress represented everything Israelites had been forced to endure under foreign rule. The assault began at dawn, launched by a mixed force of Sicarii, temple guards, and ordinary citizens armed with whatever weapons they could find. Against professional soldiers manning prepared positions, the attack should have failed within minutes. Instead, it succeeded through sheer weight of numbers and desperate courage, as wave after wave of Hebrew fighters threw themselves against the walls, with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. The Roman garrison, caught completely off guard by the ferocity of the assault, found themselves overwhelmed by attackers who seemed to welcome death as eagerly as victory. Legionaries who had faced Germanic tribes and British chariots discovered that fighting religious fanatics on their own holy ground presented challenges no military manual had prepared them for. When the fortress finally fell, its defenders dead to the last man, the rebels possessed their first real victory in 60 years of subjugation. The capture of Antonia was quickly followed by the seizure of Herod's palace, that monument to architectural excess that had housed Roman procurators and their retinues for decades. Here the rebels found not just weapons and treasure, but the archives containing decades of imperial records, tax rolls, census data, court proceedings that documented every injustice and humiliation inflicted upon their people. The destruction of these documents in a massive bonfire lit in the palace courtyard carried symbolic weight that exceeded its practical importance. As Hebrew families watched the papyrus scrolls curl and blacken in the flames, they saw their debts to imperial moneylenders, their obligations to foreign tax collectors, their legal disabilities under alien law all reduced to ash and smoke. For one shining moment, it seemed possible that the past could be burned away as easily as parchment. But even as Jerusalem erupted in celebration, cooler heads recognized that the easy victories of the first days were unlikely to continue. The capital did not suffer such humiliations lightly, and the legions that had conquered Gaul and subdued Germany would not be long in coming to restore order in their rebellious province. The rebels had achieved something unprecedented in striking their blow, but now they had to prepare for the inevitable response. The leadership that emerged from the chaos of those first weeks reflected the broad coalition that had made the revolt possible. Eleazar ben Ananias, his wounds from Florus's whips now badges of honor, commanded respect from both the religious establishment and the radical underground. Joseph ben Gurion, scion of one of Jerusalem's wealthiest families, brought financial resources and political connections that would be essential in the months ahead. Yet even as these leaders struggled to organize their forces and prepare defenses, the contradictions that had always plagued Hebrew resistance to imperial power began to surface. The Sicarii, those dagger men who had struck the first blows against collaboration, viewed any cooperation with the empire as treason worthy of death. More moderate rebels hoped to negotiate some form of autonomy that would preserve Hebrew religious rights while acknowledging imperial political supremacy. The theological debates that had simmered for decades now burst into the open as practical questions demanding immediate answers. Should the revolt aim for complete independence or settle for religious freedom under imperial oversight? Should rebels accept support from non-Hebrew enemies of the capital, potentially compromising their spiritual mission? How could they maintain their distinctive identity while waging war alongside Gentiles who worshipped foreign gods? These questions would ultimately prove as divisive as any imperial sword, but for now they remained secondary to the urgent business of preparing for the storm that was gathering beyond Judea's borders. In Syria, Cestius Gallus was assembling the 12th Legion and its auxiliaries for a march south that would test whether Hebrew religious fervor could stand against professional military power backed by the resources of empire. The rebels used their brief respite to fortify Jerusalem and gather supplies for the siege they knew must come. The city's ancient walls were repaired and strengthened, its cisterns filled with water, its granaries packed with grain, purchased or confiscated throughout the province. Weapons were manufactured in hastily established armories, while emissaries traveled throughout Palestine, seeking support from communities that had remained neutral in the conflict's opening phase. Yet even as these practical preparations proceeded, the spiritual dimension of the revolt continued to shape its character in ways that would prove both strength and weakness. This was not merely another provincial rebellion seeking better terms from the capital, but a holy war that placed divine authority above imperial command. Such absolute conviction could drive men to acts of incredible courage, but it also made compromise impossible and defeat unthinkable. As autumn approached and reports arrived of legions massing in Syria, Jerusalem prepared for the trial that would determine whether 60 years of accumulated grievances could overcome 6 centuries of military dominance. The die had been cast, the bridges burned, the point of no return passed. Whatever came next, Israelites and Romans alike understood that only one vision of justice would survive the approaching confrontation. The city that had witnessed David's triumph and Solomon's glory, that had seen Nebuchadnezzar's destruction and heard Ezra's restoration, now prepared for another test of faith and endurance that would be remembered long after its stones had crumbled to dust. In the sacred courts where the daily sacrifices for Caesar had once symbolized submission, new prayers rose to heaven, not for the empire's prosperity, but for Israel's deliverance from the power that had claimed dominion over God's chosen people. Winter's grip on the Syrian mountains had not yet loosened when Vespasian received the summons that would reshape his destiny and seal the fate of Jerusalem. In the marble halls of Nero's palace, where courtiers whispered of chariot races and theatrical performances, while an empire's eastern frontier trembled, the emperor made a decision that revealed both his desperation and his cunning. Among all the generals who might have crushed the Jewish revolt, he chose the one man whose methodical competence and unshakable loyalty offered the best hope of restoring Roman prestige without threatening imperial power. Titus Flavius Vespasianus had spent his career in the shadows of more glamorous commanders, earning victories in Britain and Germania through patient siegecraft rather than brilliant cavalry charges. His hands bore the calluses of a working soldier, his face the weathered lines of a man who slept in campaign tents rather than silk-draped chambers. Such qualities made him invaluable to an emperor who feared martial genius almost as much as he feared battlefield failure. With characteristic efficiency, Vespasian gathered the tools he would need for the coming campaign. From Syria came the 5th Macedonica and 10th Fretensis legions, their ranks filled with veterans of Eastern warfare who understood the peculiar challenges of fighting religious fanatics. From Egypt arrived additional auxiliaries, including engineers whose expertise in reducing fortifications would prove essential in the months ahead. Most precious of all, his son Titus joined the expedition, bringing with him the promise of dynastic continuity that would prove crucial when the political winds shifted. News of the approaching storm reached Jerusalem through the network of merchants and pilgrims that connected Palestine to the wider world. Initially, reports of Roman preparations were met with defiant joy. Here at last was proof that the revolt had succeeded in forcing the empire to take Jewish opposition seriously. Citizens who had lived their entire lives under occupation suddenly found themselves citizens of a free nation, preparing to defend its independence against foreign invasion. Among the rebel leadership, however, Vespasian's appointment caused considerable unease. Unlike the corrupt procurators who had governed Judea through bribery and brutality, this general commanded respect throughout the Roman establishment. His methodical approach to warfare offered no obvious weaknesses for Jewish forces to exploit, while his reputation for clemency towards surrendering enemies presented dangerous temptations to wavering allies. Preparations for the coming assault took on new urgency. As winter gave way to spring, and imperial scouts appeared on the roads leading south from Syria. Jerusalem's ancient walls received fresh attention from engineers who understood that their stones would soon face the test of professional siege engines. Weapons manufactories worked around the clock, producing spears and swords for men who had never expected to wield them, while granaries filled with grain that might need to last for years rather than months. In Galilee, where Judas the Galilean's memory still burned bright in village synagogues, local commanders prepared to meet the invaders with a mixture of religious fervor and battlefield inexperience that characterized Jewish opposition throughout the province. Chief among these was Joseph ben Matthias, a young priest from Jerusalem whose education in both Hebrew law and Greek philosophy seemed to qualify him for the impossible task of organizing Galilee's defense. Joseph's appointment reflected the complex dynamics that shaped the rebellion's leadership. Born into the priestly aristocracy that had traditionally collaborated with Roman authority, he possessed the social connections and administrative skills necessary for high command. His theological training provided credibility with religious communities that formed the revolt's spiritual backbone, while his knowledge of classical warfare theory offered hope that Jewish forces might adopt professional standards of organization and discipline. Working alongside local chieftains and established community leaders, Joseph transformed Galilee from a collection of independent villages into something approaching a unified command district. Fortifications rose around strategic towns, militias drilled with captured weapons, and supply lines developed to support sustained opposition against enemy forces. For the first time since the Maccabees, Jewish organization began to match Hebrew enthusiasm. Despite these preparations, Vespasian's invasion proceeded with the inexorable efficiency that had characterized Roman expansion for centuries. Landing at Ptolemais with 3 legions and their supporting auxiliaries, nearly 60,000 professional soldiers, the Roman commander established a base of operations that demonstrated both his strategic acumen and his respect for Hebrew capabilities. Rather than rushing inland seeking quick victory, he methodically secured his supply lines and gathered intelligence about enemy dispositions. Spring campaigns in Palestine presented unique challenges that Vespasian studied with the careful attention of a master craftsman examining unfamiliar tools. Jewish opposition drew strength from religious conviction that made normal calculations of advantage irrelevant. Men willing to die for their faith fought differently than those motivated by mere pay and plunder. Moreover, the approaching summer heat would favor defenders familiar with local conditions over invaders burdened with heavy armor and European equipment. Among Vespasian's most valuable assets was his son Titus, whose youth and energy complemented his father's experience and caution. While the elder general planned the campaign's broad strategy, Titus led reconnaissance forces that probed enemy defenses and tested Hebrew resolve in small-scale skirmishes. These encounters revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Israelite organization. Impressive individual courage offset by questionable discipline, passionate commitment undermined by factional divisions. As summer approached and imperial preparations neared completion, Vespasian launched his systematic conquest of Galilee with an assault on Jotapata, a fortress town whose capture would open the province's heartland to Caesar's forces. Built on a rocky outcrop and defended by steep approaches on 3 sides, the stronghold seemed ideally suited to withstand bombardment. Its garrison, commanded by Joseph ben Matthias himself, represented the best that Hebrew organization could produce. What followed was the reduction of fortifications elevated to the level of high art, as Roman engineers applied centuries of accumulated expertise to the problem of overcoming determined defense. Earthworks rose like geometric mountains around Jotapata's walls, providing platforms for catapults and ballistas that rained death upon the defenders. Towers advanced with the patience of predators stalking prey, while battering rams pounded against gates that had never faced such systematic destruction. Inside the fortress, Joseph ben Matthias discovered that theoretical knowledge of engineering provided poor preparation for the reality of commanding men who faced death daily. His careful plans for defense gave way to improvisation, as artillery destroyed prepared positions and created new tactical challenges hourly. Supplies dwindled with alarming speed, while casualties mounted among defenders who could not be replaced. After 47 days of bombardment, Jotapata's walls finally cracked under the relentless pounding of catapults. In the pre-dawn assault that followed, legionaries poured through the breaches like water through a broken dam, their disciplined advance overwhelming the desperate opposition of defenders who sold their lives dearly but could not prevent inevitable defeat. By sunrise, the fortress had fallen and its garrison lay dead among the rubble of their final redoubt. Among the few survivors discovered in the aftermath was Joseph ben Matthias himself, pulled from a cave where he had hidden with 40 companions during the final assault. Rather than face capture and the certain death that awaited failed rebels, His fellow survivors had chosen mass suicide, dying by their own hands rather than providing entertainment for imperial crowds. Joseph alone had rejected this final defiance, choosing life under any terms over death with honor. Brought before Vespasian in chains, the captured commander made a desperate gamble that would reshape both his own destiny and the course of the war. Drawing upon his knowledge of Hebrew prophecy and Roman superstition, he claimed to have received divine revelation regarding the general's future rise to purple. Such audacious flattery should have earned immediate execution, but something in Joseph's manner convinced Vespasian to preserve this useful prisoner for potential future service. With Galilee's organized opposition broken at Jotapata, Roman forces proceeded to methodically reduce the remaining strongholds that dotted the province's landscape. Each town that fell provided lessons in the futility of resisting authority, while simultaneously demonstrating the terrible price that such defiance would exact from those who persisted in rebellion. Refugees fleeing the advance carried tales of destruction that served Vespasian's purposes as effectively as actual conquest. Among the most tragic of these defeats was Gamla, a fortress town perched on a mountain spur that seemed impregnable to conventional assault. Its defenders, inspired by accounts of Jotapata's heroic stand, prepared to make their fight with the fierce determination of men who knew retreat was impossible. When artillery finally breached their walls after months of bombardment, the survivors chose mass suicide rather than surrender, hurling themselves from the cliffs rather than submit to imperial justice. Such acts of collective martyrdom provided inspiring examples for Hebrew opposition, but did little to slow Vespasian's methodical advance through the province. By autumn, Galilee lay prostrate under occupation, its towns garrisoned by legions, and its countryside pacified through the systematic application of terror and reward. Surviving defenders had either fled south toward Jerusalem or accepted pardons that came with strict conditions about future loyalty to Caesar's authority. Throughout this campaign, Vespasian demonstrated the qualities that had recommended him to Nero's attention. Rather than rushing toward quick victories that might have enhanced his personal reputation while leaving enemy opposition intact, he pursued the systematic destruction of Hebrew capability with a patience that bordered on obsession. Every fortified position was reduced according to established procedures, every act of defiance punished with measured brutality designed to discourage future rebellion. In Jerusalem, news of Galilee's fall struck the rebel leadership like a physical blow. The province that had given birth to Judas the Galilean and nurtured the revolutionary spirit for generations now lay under Roman occupation, its defenders dead or scattered. More troubling still were reports of the systematic efficiency with which imperial forces had conducted their campaign. This was not the brutal improvisation of corrupt procurators, but the methodical application of science by professionals who understood their craft. Winter's approach provided temporary respite from active campaigning, but it also brought ominous news from the wider Roman world. Political unrest in the capital, combined with disasters along the Germanic frontier, had begun to raise questions about Nero's continued fitness for rule. Such instability might have provided opportunities for Hebrew negotiators to exploit weakness, but the rebellion's religious character made compromise impossible for leaders who saw their struggle in cosmic rather than merely political terms. Among Vespasian's legions, the pause in active operations provided time for the careful planning that would characterize the next phase of the war. Intelligence gathered during the Galilee campaign revealed the complex dynamics that shaped Hebrew opposition, the fierce loyalty that religious conviction could inspire, the factional divisions that weakened unified command. the tactical limitations that resulted from inexperience in professional warfare. Such knowledge would prove invaluable when operations resumed with spring's arrival. As 68 AD dawned with its promise of renewed conflict, both sides prepared for struggles that would determine whether the Jewish revolt represented a temporary disruption of Roman authority or the beginning of collapse in the East. Vespasian's methodical approach had succeeded in containing the rebellion within Palestine while demonstrating military superiority, but Jerusalem remained unconquered and the revolt's spiritual leadership intact. In the ancient city where David had established his kingdom and Solomon built his temple, preparations for the coming trial took on the character of sacred ritual. Citizens who had tasted freedom for 2 brief years now faced the prospect of defending that independence against odds that would have daunted more experienced powers. Yet their confidence drew strength from sources that imperial calculation could not easily measure. Prophecies that promised divine intervention, traditions that recalled miraculous deliverances, and faith that placed ultimate victory in hands more powerful than any earthly emperor. Across the empire, the year 69 AD would be remembered as the time when the foundations of imperial power cracked like pottery in an earthquake, releasing forces that would reshape the known world. In distant Germania, where winter winds howled through forests that had swallowed Varus's legions, rebellious tribes sensed weakness in their Roman overlords and sharpened their spears for spring campaigns. Along the Rhine frontier, entire legions declared allegiance to rival claimants, while their officers calculated the rewards of backing the winning candidate. But nowhere did political upheaval carry greater consequences than in the Syrian headquarters, where Vespasian received word that Nero Caesar had fallen by his own hand, leaving the purple available to whichever general possessed both ambition and strength to seize it. With characteristic deliberation, the conqueror of Galilee weighed his options while maintaining the facade of continued loyalty to whoever happened to occupy the throne in the capital. Unlike the rash commanders who had rushed to declare themselves emperor only to die within months of their proclamations, Vespasian understood that successful rebellion required more than military skill. It demanded political patience, financial resources, and above all, the kind of methodical planning that had made him valuable to Nero in the first place. Among his most crucial decisions during these months of uncertainty was the elevation of his son Titus to supreme command of the Hebrew campaign. At 29 years old, the younger Flavian had already demonstrated the combination of tactical brilliance and administrative competence that marked him as worthy of his father's trust. More importantly, his appointment allowed Vespasian to pursue imperial ambitions while maintaining the fiction that the war in Palestine continued under legitimate authority. Titus accepted his new responsibilities with the sober recognition that success in Judea would either establish his family's claim to lasting power or ensure their destruction if his father's bid for the purple failed. Unlike the provincial campaigns that had marked his earlier career, this assignment carried implications that reached far beyond mere military victory. The Jewish revolt had become a test of Roman capability itself. To fail here would encourage rebellion throughout the eastern provinces, while success would demonstrate that the Flavian dynasty possessed the strength to hold together an empire that seemed to be dissolving into chaos. Intelligence reports reaching Syrian headquarters painted an increasingly complex picture of the situation within Palestine. Jerusalem remained unconquered, its walls intact and its population determined to resist any attempt at imperial restoration. Yet the city's strength concealed fatal weaknesses that careful strategy might exploit. 3 distinct factions now competed for control of the rebellion, their mutual animosity so intense that civil war had broken out, even while legions gathered for the final assault. John of Gischala, that cunning survivor of Galilee's destruction, had established himself in the temple precincts with a following drawn from the most radical elements of the revolt. His zealots preached absolute resistance to any compromise with foreign authority, viewing negotiation itself as blasphemy against divine sovereignty. Their theological certainty provided tremendous motivation for individual acts of courage, but it also made unified command nearly impossible when dealing with leaders who acknowledged no earthly superior. Simon Bar Giora controlled much of the lower city through a coalition that included escaped slaves, displaced farmers, and urban poor who saw the revolt as an opportunity to overturn not just Roman rule, but the entire social order that had oppressed them for generations. His appeal to class grievances attracted followers throughout Palestine, but it also terrified the wealthy families whose support any successful rebellion required. Simon's revolution threatened to become as dangerous to Hebrew elites as to imperial authority. Eleazar ben Simon commanded the temple's inner courts with forces drawn primarily from the priestly establishment and their traditional supporters. His faction represented what remained of moderate leadership, men who had initiated resistance to imperial tyranny, but now wondered whether their cause might be preserved through negotiation rather than total war. This group possessed the religious legitimacy that the other factions lacked, but their willingness to consider compromise made them suspect to more radical elements. Among Titus's advantages as he prepared for the final campaign was his intimate knowledge of these divisions, gleaned through months of interrogating prisoners and deserters who provided detailed intelligence about Jerusalem's internal conflicts. Where his predecessors had seen monolithic Hebrew resistance, he perceived opportunities to exploit factional disputes that might prove more effective than direct assault against the city's formidable defenses. More conventional military preparations proceeded with the methodical efficiency that had characterized Flavian operations from the beginning. 4 full legions would participate in the assault: V. Macedonica, Ex Fretensis, Futisa Fulminata, and 15th Apollinaris, each contributing its particular expertise to the coming attack. Engineers studied detailed plans of Jerusalem's triple wall system, calculating the resources needed to breach defenses that had been strengthened continuously since the revolt began. Supply arrangements required unprecedented logistical sophistication, given the distance from reliable bases and the likelihood of extended operations. Wagon trains stretched across hundreds of miles carried not just weapons and food, but the specialized equipment necessary for reducing one of the ancient world's most formidable fortified cities. Catapults and ballistas were assembled in Syrian workshops before being transported in pieces for final assembly near the target, while towers rose in Egyptian shipyards that understood the engineering requirements of mobile fortifications. Throughout the winter months, as political chaos consumed the empire and rival emperors rose and fell in bloody succession, Titus maintained the disciplined focus that would prove essential when active campaigning resumed. Training exercises prepared his forces for the unique challenges they would face, fighting in confined urban spaces against desperate defenders, maintaining morale during what might prove to be months of grinding warfare, distinguishing between combatants and civilians in a population where every individual might be an enemy. Intelligence networks established during Vespasian's earlier campaigns provided detailed information about Jerusalem's defenses and the factional disputes that weakened unified resistance. Josephus, the former rebel commander who had become a trusted advisor, offered insights into Hebrew psychology and military capabilities that no other source could provide. His knowledge of the temple's layout, the city's water supply, and the personalities commanding different factions would prove invaluable in the months ahead. As spring approached and Vespasian's claim to imperial power gained acceptance throughout the eastern provinces, Titus began moving his forces south for the campaign that would either establish Flavian dominance or destroy the dynasty before it could take root. 4 legions totaling nearly 60,000 men represented the largest concentration of military power ever assembled for operations in Palestine. A force capable of conquering kingdoms, yet facing an assault that would test every aspect of their professional competence. Advance units reached the hills overlooking Jerusalem in early spring, their appearance sending shockwaves through the city's population. Citizens who had grown accustomed to living in an independent Hebrew state suddenly confronted the reality that their brief freedom was about to be tested by the full might of imperial power. From the temple courts to the poorest neighborhoods, families made final preparations for an ordeal that everyone understood would determine not just the city's fate, but the future of their entire people. Reconnaissance revealed that Jerusalem's defenses had been significantly strengthened since the revolt began. The outer wall, hastily constructed during the early stages of the rebellion, now boasted professionally designed fortifications that would require systematic assault to breach. Behind this barrier, the more ancient second wall provided another line of resistance, while the inner wall protecting the temple and upper city represented the strongest position of all. Engineering surveys conducted by specialist officers identified potential weaknesses in Jerusalem's defensive system, while revealing the magnitude of the task ahead. Unlike typical ancient cities, Jerusalem enjoyed multiple sources of water that could sustain a lengthy investment, while its granaries held supplies accumulated over 3 years of preparation. Any assault would need to combine traditional techniques with innovative approaches designed for this particular target. Within Jerusalem, news of the approaching legions sparked fierce debates among the rival factions that had been maneuvering for advantage since Vespasian's withdrawal. Some leaders argued for immediate surrender negotiations that might preserve the temple and save civilian lives, while others insisted that divine intervention would ensure victory regardless of military odds. These theological disputes reflected deeper questions about the nature of covenant faith and its relationship to political reality. John of Gishala used preparations as evidence that compromise had become impossible. Only total resistance could preserve Hebrew religious identity against an enemy determined to destroy their distinctive way of life. His supporters pointed to successful resistance movements throughout history, arguing that faith and determination could overcome any material disadvantage when the cause was righteous. Simon bar Giora approached the crisis from a different perspective, viewing the threat as an opportunity to forge class unity against oppression. His speeches emphasized social justice themes that resonated with Jerusalem's poor, while promising revolutionary changes that would create a more equitable society once independence was secured. Such appeals attracted followers, but also alarmed moderate leaders who feared social upheaval as much as foreign conquest. Eleazar ben Simon struggled to maintain his faction's influence while navigating between the extremes represented by his rivals. His supporters included many who had initiated the revolt, but now questioned whether religious goals might be achieved through negotiation rather than military confrontation. This group possessed significant influence within the priestly establishment, but lacked the passionate commitment that energized their more radical competitors. Religious considerations shaped these debates in ways that imperial observers found difficult to understand. For Jewish leaders, the approaching assault represented more than a political or military crisis. It was a test of covenant faith that would determine whether the Almighty remained committed to his chosen people. Prophecies were consulted, omens interpreted, and ancient precedents examined as communities prepared for trials that seemed to echo the great disasters of earlier eras. As Titus completed his deployment and established positions around Jerusalem's perimeter, both sides prepared for a confrontation that would be remembered long after its immediate participants had passed into history. Imperial confidence drew strength from professional competence and overwhelming material advantage, while Hebrew determination rested on religious conviction and the desperate courage of people fighting for their survival as a distinct community. Preliminary skirmishes around Jerusalem's gates provided glimpses of the intensity that would characterize the coming ordeal. Probing attacks met fierce resistance from defenders who seemed to welcome death rather than retreat, while Hebrew sorties against imperial positions demonstrated tactical skill that surprised officers who had expected to face only religious fanatics. These encounters established the pattern of vicious fighting that would consume both sides in the months ahead. Final preparations within Jerusalem revealed the extent to which 3 years of independence had transformed the city's character. Weapons manufactories operated around the clock, producing arms for civilian militias, while engineers strengthened defensive positions with innovations borrowed from military manuals. Citizens who had never expected to become soldiers now trained with captured equipment, preparing to defend their homes against invaders whose reputation for ruthlessness was well established. Among the most poignant aspects of these final preparations was the fate of Jerusalem's children, caught between parents determined to resist and circumstances that offered little hope for survival. Families made heartbreaking decisions about whether to send their young ones away to relatives in other cities or keep them close during whatever trials lay ahead. These personal tragedies reflected the larger catastrophe that was about to engulf an entire civilization. Religious observances took on new intensity as Jerusalem prepared for the coming trial, with daily prayers focusing increasingly on themes of divine deliverance and national redemption. The temple services that had once symbolized accommodation with imperial authority now became rallying points for resistance, their ancient rhythms providing stability in a world turned upside down by war and revolution. As summer approached and artillery began their methodical work, Jerusalem entered what would prove to be the final chapter of its existence as the center of ancient Jewish civilization. The city that had witnessed David's triumph and Solomon's glory, that had survived Babylonian conquest and Persian restoration, now faced its ultimate test against forces that possessed both the means and the will to erase it entirely from the map of human habitation. Death came to Jerusalem not with the sudden violence of storm or earthquake, but with the patient persistence of winter settling over mountain peaks. As Titus completed his circumvallation around the holy city in the scorching heat of late spring, trapping nearly 1 million souls within walls that had once promised protection, the true nature of the coming ordeal began to reveal itself. This would not be the swift conquest that Roman efficiency typically delivered, nor the glorious martyrdom that Jewish prophecy had foretold, but something far more terrible, a grinding test of endurance that would strip away every illusion about the nobility of war. Behind the triple walls that had defied conquerors for centuries, 3 rival armies continued their fratricidal conflict, even as imperial artillery began its methodical destruction of the outer defenses. John of Gischala commanded the temple precincts with fanatic determination, viewing every compromise as betrayal of divine mandate. Simon Bar Giora controlled the lower city through appeals to class hatred that promised revolution beyond mere independence. Eleazar ben Simon held the inner courts with forces drawn from families whose wealth and status had crumbled along with Roman authority. Among the most tragic aspects of this internal warfare was its timing. while legions dug their trenches and assembled their engines. Hebrew swords drew Hebrew blood in battles that served no purpose except satisfying personal ambition and ideological purity. Grain stores that might have sustained the population through months of investment were destroyed in factional raids. Weapons desperately needed for defense were turned against fellow resistors, and the unified command essential for successful resistance dissolved into chaos. Outside the walls, Titus applied lessons learned from his father's methodical conquest of Galilee. Rather than rushing forward in costly assaults against prepared positions, he ordered construction of a circumvallation that would seal Jerusalem as completely as cork seals a wine jar. This barrier, built with typical Roman efficiency, consisted of earthworks topped with sharpened stakes and patrolled by sentries whose orders were to kill anyone attempting escape. Construction of the circumvallation required enormous labor, as thousands of legionaries and auxiliaries moved earth under the Palestinian sun that seemed to grow hotter with each passing day. Stone had to be quarried from surrounding hills, timber cut from increasingly distant forests, and water carried from sources that Hebrew raiders tried desperately to poison or destroy. Yet the work proceeded with inexorable efficiency, each day bringing the barrier closer to completion. Within Jerusalem, the reality of complete encirclement struck the population like a physical blow. Citizens who had endured 3 years of intermittent warfare suddenly faced the prospect of slow starvation as their final supplies dwindled and no relief could penetrate the imperial cordon. Prices for basic necessities began the upward spiral that would eventually make a handful of grain worth more than gold, while families hoarded whatever food they possessed against neighbors who had once been friends. Starvation crept through Jerusalem's streets like plague, claiming first the weakest, infants who could not compete for their mother's failing milk, elderly grandparents who surrendered their portions to younger relatives, sick and disabled individuals whose needs exceeded their usefulness in the desperate struggle for survival. Bodies began appearing in doorways and alleys, while survivors grew too weak to bury the dead with proper ceremony. Religious authorities struggled to maintain traditional observances as conditions deteriorated beyond anything experienced in living memory. Daily sacrifices continued at the temple altar, but the animals required for proper ritual became increasingly scarce and expensive. Prayers took on new urgency as congregations dwindled, and the theological implications of their suffering demanded explanations that tested faith itself. Meanwhile, Roman artillery pounded Jerusalem's outer defenses with patient brutality, designed to weaken both stone and morale. Catapults hurled massive stones that shattered ancient masonry, while ballistas sent iron bolts through any gap in the defensive works. The constant bombardment made sleep impossible for those living near the walls, while the crash of falling stones provided grim percussion for a city slowly dying. Hebrew resistance responded with desperate ingenuity born of necessity. Sorties launched under cover of darkness struck at imperial positions, seeking to destroy engines and kill artillerists whose expertise made them particularly valuable targets. These attacks required tremendous courage, as the fighters knew that capture meant crucifixion, yet they continued because surrender promised only slightly slower death. Counter-artillery, built from salvaged materials and improvised techniques, occasionally achieved success against Roman positions, but Israelite engineers lacked both the resources and experience to match imperial siegecraft. Every catapult destroyed could be replaced from Syrian workshops, while Hebrew losses were permanent. Gradually, systematically, imperial firepower overwhelmed defensive efforts. As summer reached its peak and the circumvallation neared completion, Conditions within Jerusalem deteriorated beyond anything recorded in Israelite memory. Families that had once enjoyed comfortable circumstances found themselves competing with beggars for scraps that would have been fed to dogs in better times. Leather was boiled for whatever nutrition it might provide, while grass and leaves disappeared from every accessible space. Desperation drove some to escape attempts that had little chance of success, but offered the only alternative to slow death within the walls. These fugitives crept through sewers and climbed down cliff faces, seeking gaps in imperial patrols, or hoping to bribe sentries with whatever valuables they still possessed. Few succeeded, and those who were captured provided entertainment for legionaries who had grown bored with routine garrison duty. Titus faced his own challenges as the investment dragged on longer than anticipated. Maintaining discipline among troops who had expected quick victory required constant attention, while supplies for his own forces stretched thin despite careful logistical planning. Disease began appearing in the camps as summer heat and inadequate sanitation created conditions that favored epidemic illness over human health. Political pressure from the new Flavian regime added urgency to military considerations. Vespasian needed visible success in Palestine to consolidate his claim to imperial power, while delay in completing the Jewish campaign encouraged other provinces to question strength. Titus understood that his father's dynasty might not survive a prolonged failure to reduce one rebellious city. Within Jerusalem, the three-way civil war that had weakened defense from the beginning finally approached its bloody conclusion. Eleazar ben Simon's moderate faction, caught between John's fanatics and Simon's revolutionaries, found itself ground down by enemies who viewed compromise as treason. His death in factional fighting eliminated the last voice willing to consider negotiated settlement. Surviving this brutal consolidation, John of Gischala and Simon bar Giora established an uneasy cooperation that allowed more effective resistance to assault. Yet the price of unity had been enormous. Thousands of fighters killed in internecine warfare, irreplaceable supplies destroyed in factional raids, and civilian morale shattered by witnessing Hebrew kill Hebrew while enemies waited outside the walls. As autumn approached, Roman engineers began preparing for direct assault against Jerusalem's weakened outer defenses. Siege towers rose like wooden mountains, their timber frames protected by iron plates and bristling with catapults designed to sweep resistors from the ramparts. These mobile fortresses required hundreds of men to move, but could deliver concentrated firepower wherever resistance seemed strongest. Battering rams, their bronze heads shaped like the animals whose power they borrowed, were wheeled forward under protective sheds that shielded operators from defensive missiles. These engines pounded against gates and wall sections with methodical persistence, each blow weakening ancient masonry that had withstood centuries of weather and warfare. The sound of their impact echoed through Jerusalem like funeral drums. Hebrew opposition responded with everything they possessed. Boiling oil poured from the ramparts. Massive stones dropped on attackers. Fire arrows shot at wooden siege engines. Desperate sorties launched against imperial positions. Individual acts of heroism became commonplace as ordinary citizens performed extraordinary deeds in defense of their holy city. Yet courage alone could not overcome the systematic application of superior resources and professional expertise. Breakthrough came at the outer wall during a night assault that caught the garrison exhausted from days of constant bombardment. Legionaries poured through the breach like water through a broken dam, establishing positions that could not be dislodged despite fierce counterattacks. Dawn revealed imperial standards flying from ramparts that had never before hosted foreign banners. Fighting withdrew to the second wall, where Hebrew resistance stiffened as forces fell back on positions they knew more intimately. Street fighting replaced open battle as the conflict moved into Jerusalem's crowded neighborhoods, where every house became a fortress and every alley a potential ambush site. This urban warfare favored those who could use civilian buildings for cover, while forcing attackers to advance through unfamiliar terrain. Roman tactics adapted to these new conditions with characteristic flexibility. Small units replaced massed formations, engineers became more valuable than cavalry, and patience proved more effective than aggression. House by house, street by street, imperial control expanded through the outer districts, while Hebrew resistance contracted toward the temple complex and upper city. Civilians caught between the opposing forces faced impossible choices that revealed war's moral complexity. Fleeing toward imperial lines might bring safety, but also mark them as traitors in Hebrew eyes. Remaining in their homes risked becoming casualties when fighting swept through their neighborhoods. Seeking refuge in the temple courts meant joining an increasingly desperate population whose survival depended on dwindling supplies. Josephus, the former Hebrew commander who had become Titus's advisor, attempted to negotiate surrender through speeches delivered from Roman positions to fighters on the walls. His appeals emphasized the futility of continued resistance and promised merciful treatment for those who submitted before the city's final fall. These efforts met with arrows and curses from men who viewed him as the ultimate example of collaboration with tyranny. Religious considerations complicated every aspect of the deteriorating situation. Hebrew resistance believed they fought not just for political independence, but for the temple itself, that sacred space where the divine presence dwelt among mortals. To surrender Jerusalem meant abandoning the very center of their covenant relationship with the Almighty. Such theological stakes made compromise impossible, regardless of military realities. As winter threatened and the second wall finally fell to sustained assault, the remaining warriors withdrew to their final positions around the temple complex and Herod's palace. Here, surrounded by the holiest sites of their faith, they prepared for the last act of a tragedy that had consumed their generation. Outside these final barriers, imperial forces gathered for assaults that would either complete their victory or exhaust their strength in Pyrrhic triumph. Starvation had become the siege's most effective weapon, more devastating than any catapult or battering ram. Bodies filled the streets faster than the living could remove them, while survivors grew so weak that resistance became physically impossible for many who remained spiritually committed to the cause. Yet still the fighters held their positions, sustained by faith that transcended earthly calculation. In the temple courts where sacrifice and prayer had sanctified daily life for centuries, the last free Israelites prepared to meet whatever fate awaited them. They had witnessed the destruction of their outer defenses, endured the loss of most of their city, and survived starvation that had claimed family members and friends. Now, as Roman artillery targeted the sacred precincts themselves, they faced the ultimate test of whether faith could triumph over force. Fire consumed the heavens above Jerusalem on the 9th day of the month Av, as flames that had begun in the sacred courts climbed toward the throne of the Almighty himself. What mortals had built over centuries to honor the divine presence, other mortals destroyed in hours through the terrible alchemy of war and hatred. The smoke that rose from Solomon's ancient foundations carried with it more than stone and timber. It bore the dreams of a people, the center of a faith, and the last remnants of a world that had endured since David first made this rocky hill the heart of his kingdom. Within the temple complex, where morning sacrifices had sanctified each dawn for nearly 600 years, the final act of Jewish resistance prepared to right itself in blood and flame. Behind walls that had never known foreign footsteps, the last defenders of Jerusalem gathered whatever strength remained in bodies weakened by months of starvation and souls tested by trials that seemed to exceed even the sufferings of Job. These men and women, for desperation, had erased traditional distinctions between warrior and civilian, male and female, represented all that survived of Jewish independence. The architecture itself seemed to embody the theological stakes of the coming battle. Herod's magnificent reconstruction had transformed the modest sacred building of earlier eras into a complex that rivaled any structure in the Roman world, its courts capable of holding hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, its walls rising like marble cliffs toward heaven. Every stone had been cut to glorify the God of Israel, every column placed to channel human prayer toward divine attention. To destroy such a place was to challenge heaven itself. Among the defenders who prepared for their final stand, theological debates raged with an intensity that seemed almost absurd, given their desperate circumstances. Some argued that divine intervention must surely come now that the sacred precincts faced direct assault. Had not the Almighty promised that his house would endure forever? Others whispered that perhaps their sufferings represented divine punishment for some collective sin, that surrender might preserve what remained of their people, even if it meant losing their most holy place. John of Gishala, whose iron will had sustained Jewish resistance through months of deteriorating conditions, moved among the fighters with words of encouragement that drew strength from sources beyond mere human endurance. His speeches wove together prophecy and memory, reminding exhausted defenders of Hanukkah's miracle, of David's triumph over Goliath, of all the times when faith had overcome impossible odds. Yet even he could not entirely conceal the desperation that gnawed at hearts that had witnessed too much death and destruction. Simon Bar-Giora approached the crisis with characteristic bluntness, acknowledging that military defeat seemed inevitable, while insisting that their manner of dying would determine how history remembered their cause. Better to fall fighting in the holiest place on earth than to live as slaves in foreign lands. Better to perish defending God's house than to survive its desecration through compromise with tyranny. His appeals to honor resonated with fighters who had already sacrificed everything for this moment. Outside the sacred walls, Titus wrestled with decisions that would determine not just the campaign's outcome, but his own place in history. The emperor's son understood that destroying the holy complex would eliminate the spiritual center of Jewish opposition, making future rebellions less likely, while providing Roman forces with a decisive demonstration of power. Yet he also recognized that such an act would be remembered as the ultimate expression of Roman ruthlessness, a deed that would echo through centuries. Intelligence gathered by Josephus and other informants revealed the complex layout of the sacred precincts, with its multiple courtyards providing successive lines of defense that would need to be overcome separately. The court of the Gentiles, where merchants had once conducted business under Solomon's portico, now bristled with improvised fortifications and desperate defenders. Beyond this lay the court of women, then the court of Israel, and finally the inner shrine itself, each representing both a military objective and a theological challenge. Roman engineering expertise faced its ultimate test as siege engines designed for conventional walls encountered architecture that had never been intended for defense, yet possessed natural advantages that professional fortification could not improve. The sacred complex's position on Mount Moriah provided commanding views in all directions, while its massive retaining walls offered defensive capabilities that their builders had never intended. Every approach required attackers to advance uphill against positions that could not be flanked or bypassed. Preliminary assaults against the outer courts revealed the ferocity that would characterize the final phase of the siege. Jewish fighters, driven beyond normal human endurance by starvation and religious fervor, met Roman professionalism with a desperation that transformed ordinary citizens into formidable opponents. Women fought beside men, children carried stones and arrows to adult warriors. Elderly priests chose death over surrender when Roman legionaries breached their defensive positions. Artillery bombardment that had proved effective against conventional fortifications achieved limited success against the massive construction of Herod's masterpiece. Stones that could shatter normal masonry, barely chipped blocks that weighed tons, and had been fitted together with mathematical precision. The constant barrage created clouds of dust and debris that made fighting conditions hellish for both sides, while the noise of impact echoed off surrounding hills like the percussion of divine wrath. As spring turned towards summer and the siege entered its most desperate phase, conditions within the sacred complex deteriorated beyond anything recorded in human memory. Bodies of those who had died from starvation or wounds lay unburied in corners of courtyards where incense had once carried prayers toward heaven. The living survivors, reduced to skeletal shadows of their former selves, sustained themselves on leather, grass, and whatever organic matter could be found within the holy precincts. Water became more precious than gold, as Roman forces systematically cut off every source of supply that had sustained the city through previous sieges. The pools and cisterns that had provided abundance during pilgrimage festivals now echoed emptily, their dry stones bearing witness to the thoroughness of imperial strategy. Thirst joined starvation as a weapon more effective than any catapult or battering ram. Religious observances continued, despite conditions that made traditional ritual nearly impossible. Priests who had lost everything except their faith maintained abbreviated versions of ancient ceremonies, using whatever materials could be salvaged from the destruction around them. These services provided spiritual sustenance for defenders whose physical bodies had been reduced to skin and bone, while their familiar rhythms offered stability in a world turned upside down by war and suffering. The breakthrough, when it came, resulted not from any single assault, but from the accumulation of pressure that finally overwhelmed defensive capabilities stretched beyond their limits. Roman forces penetrated the court of the Gentiles during a night attack that caught exhausted guards unable to maintain effective vigilance. By dawn, Roman standards flew from positions that commanded the entire outer complex, while surviving defenders fell back to inner courtyards that offered little hope of prolonged resistance. Fighting in the confined spaces of the inner courts took on characteristics unlike anything in previous military experience. Every pillar became a fortress, every doorway a killing ground where small numbers of defenders could hold off much larger attacking forces through intimate knowledge of terrain that invaders had to learn through costly trial and error. The marble floors that had once reflected lamplight from golden menorahs now grew slippery with blood from both sides. Josephus made one final attempt at negotiation, standing beneath the walls where his former comrades could hear his words while remaining safe from imperial weapons. His speech emphasized the hopelessness of continued resistance and promised honorable treatment for those who surrendered before the final assault began. The response came in the form of arrows and curses from men who viewed him as the ultimate symbol of collaboration with tyranny, his survival proof that accommodation with the empire meant the death of everything they held sacred. Titus himself appeared at the front lines as his forces prepared for the final assault on the inner shrine itself, that innermost holy place where Jewish belief placed the very presence of the Almighty among mortals. Historical accounts differ regarding his intentions. Some claim he ordered the sacred building preserved as a monument to Roman clemency, while others suggest he recognized that only complete destruction would eliminate the spiritual foundation of future resistance. The assault on the inner shrine began at dawn, with artillery bombardment designed to breach the massive gates that protected the holiest place in Jewish faith. These portals, crafted from precious materials and decorated with artistic treasures accumulated over centuries, crumbled under the impact of stones hurled by catapults. Each breach created openings through which Roman legionaries poured like water through a broken dam. Within the Holy of Holies itself, the final defenders made their stand among treasures that represented the accumulated devotion of generations. Golden vessels used for sacrifice, silver trumpets that had announced festivals, precious stones that had decorated the high priest's breastplate, all became either weapons in desperate hands or prizes for conquering soldiers who understood their monetary value without grasping their spiritual significance. The fire that would consume the sacred complex began, according to most accounts, when a Roman soldier threw a burning brand through a window during the height of battle. Whether this act occurred on orders from Titus or represented individual initiative by a legionary caught up in combat fury remains disputed by historians. What cannot be denied is the speed with which flames spread through wooden structures that had been dried by months of siege conditions. Cedar beams, imported from Lebanon centuries earlier, became fuel for an inferno that quickly spread beyond any possibility of control. The fire consumed not just timber and fabric, but the accumulated treasures of Jewish devotion, scrolls containing ancient prayers, vessels crafted by master artisans, decorations that had taken generations to complete. Smoke rose from the burning holy place like incense from some cosmic altar, carrying with it the physical remnants of a religious tradition older than the empire itself. Hebrew defenders trapped within the burning inner chambers faced choices that tested faith beyond any previous trial. Some chose to die fighting imperial soldiers rather than flee the sacred flames, their bodies found later clutching weapons beside the charred remains of holy objects they had tried to defend. Others hurled themselves into the fire rather than face capture, choosing death by flame over death by crucifixion or slavery. A few priests, according to later accounts, gathered the keys to the holy place and threw them toward heaven, declaring that they returned their sacred trust to the one who had originally bestowed it. Legionaries who penetrated the burning chambers during their final moments encountered scenes that would haunt survivors for the remainder of their lives. The golden table for showbread melted in the intense heat, while the great menorah that had illuminated the holy place for centuries became twisted metal sculpture, bearing witness to destruction beyond imagination. Even hardened veterans who had witnessed the sack of cities found themselves shaken by the totality of devastation they had unleashed. The collapse of the roof sent clouds of sparks and burning debris across the entire sacred complex, igniting secondary fires that completed the destruction of courtyards and porticos that had somehow survived the initial conflagration. These flames consumed not just buildings, but the archives that had preserved Hebrew legal traditions, genealogical records that traced family lineages back to biblical times, and manuscripts containing interpretations of law that represented centuries of scholarly work. As the fire raged through the night, its glow visible from hilltops throughout Palestine, survivors throughout the Hebrew world understood that something irreplaceable had been lost. The sacred complex had provided not just a center for worship, but a symbol of divine presence that sustained identity across the diaspora. Its destruction meant that their faith would need to discover new forms of expression, new ways of maintaining connection with the Almighty, without the sacrificial system that had defined religious practice since Solomon's time. Titus surveyed the destruction with emotions that mixed satisfaction at military success with recognition of the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The rebellion that had challenged imperial authority for 4 years lay crushed beneath smoking ruins, its leaders dead or captured, its spiritual center reduced to ashes that would blow across Palestine with the next strong wind. Yet the totality of victory carried its own burden. He had destroyed not just a building, but a world. Morning light revealed the full extent of the catastrophe that had befallen Jerusalem. Where the sacred complex had stood for nearly 6 centuries, only blackened stone and twisted metal remained. The courts that had witnessed Jesus cleansing the money changers, heard Paul defending his ministry, and seen countless pilgrims offer their devotions to the God of Israel, were littered with debris that would take generations to clear. The holy place, where priests had maintained daily sacrifice since the return from Babylonian exile, lay in ruins that proclaimed the end of an era. Scattered throughout the complex, imperial soldiers gathered treasures that would grace Vespasian's triumph when the campaign finally ended. Golden vessels, silver implements, precious stones, and artistic objects created by master craftsmen were loaded onto wagons that would carry them to the capital as visible proof of victory. These items, torn from their sacred context, would become museum pieces and curiosities rather than instruments of worship. Among the prisoners taken during the final hours were priests and teachers whose knowledge of Hebrew law and tradition made them valuable for future administrative purposes. These survivors, chained and destined for slavery or gladiatorial combat, represented the living remnant of a religious establishment that had guided life for centuries. Their fate symbolized the broader tragedy that had befallen their entire people. The destruction of the sacred complex marked not just the end of the siege, but the conclusion of a way of life that had defined Hebrew existence since the return from Babylon. Sacrificial worship, priestly mediation, pilgrimage festivals, and all the rhythms of religious observance centered on this holy place would need to find new expressions or disappear entirely. The challenge facing surviving communities would be whether their faith could adapt to existence without its ancient center. As flames died down and smoke cleared from the mount, revealing the full magnitude of destruction, both victors and vanquished understood that they had witnessed a turning point in human history. The empire had demonstrated that no religious or cultural tradition, however ancient, could withstand the systematic application of power. Hebrew faith would need to discover whether spiritual devotion could survive without the physical structures that had previously sustained it. In the days that followed, as Caesar's forces completed their occupation of Jerusalem and began the grim task of disposing of bodies and clearing rubble, the implications of the destruction began to resonate throughout the ancient world. Israelites scattered across the Mediterranean received news of the catastrophe with mourning that exceeded even the grief following Babylonian conquest centuries earlier. This time, there would be no return from exile, no rebuilding of what had been lost, no restoration of the old order. The fire that had consumed the sacred building in a single night burned away more than stone and timber. It destroyed the central institution around which Hebrew life had been organized for 600 years. In its place would eventually arise new forms of religious expression, new ways of maintaining covenant with the divine, new methods of preserving identity without the sacrificial system that had previously defined the faith. But all of that lay in an uncertain future. For now, there was only the smoking ruin where heaven and earth had once met in daily sacrifice and prayer. Silence settled over Jerusalem, like a shroud in the days following the temple's destruction, broken only by the sound of Roman soldiers clearing rubble and the distant weeping of survivors who wandered through ruins that had once been the center of their world, where morning prayers had risen toward heaven for 6 centuries. Now only the crackle of dying embers and the harsh commands of occupation forces disturbed the desolation. The holy city that had witnessed David's psalms and Solomon's wisdom lay prostrate beneath foreign boots, its sacred stones scattered like broken dreams across Mount Moriah's blood-stained summit. Titus surveyed his conquest from the ramparts of Herod's palace, with emotions that mixed triumph and unease in proportions he could not quite measure. The rebellion that had challenged Roman authority for 4 desperate years was finally crushed, its leaders dead or chained, its spiritual foundation reduced to ashes that would blow across Palestine with the next strong wind. Yet the totality of victory carried burdens that the young general was only beginning to comprehend. He had destroyed not merely a city, but a civilization, erased not just political resistance, but the religious heart of an entire people. Intelligence reports from across the province painted a picture of devastation that exceeded even the most pessimistic military estimates. Jerusalem's population, swollen to perhaps 1 million souls by refugees and pilgrims trapped within the walls during the siege, had been reduced to perhaps 100,000 survivors, the rest claimed by starvation, disease, warfare, and the systematic executions that followed the city's fall. The demographic catastrophe represented the near extinction of Jewish life in the heartland, where it had flourished since the return from Babylon. Among the most pressing challenges facing the new administration was the disposal of corpses that littered every street and building in the conquered city. Bodies of those who had died during the siege lay where they had fallen, too numerous for the living to bury, even when strength and opportunity had permitted such mercies. Roman work gangs, supplemented by surviving inhabitants pressed into service, labored for weeks to clear the decomposing remains that threatened to breed pestilence among conquerors and conquered alike. The systematic looting of Jerusalem proceeded with typical Roman efficiency, as soldiers inventoried and removed anything of value that had survived the fires. Golden vessels from the sacred treasury, silver ornaments from wealthy homes, precious stones, jewelry, artwork, and rare manuscripts. All were catalogued and prepared for shipment to the capital, where they would grace Vespasian's triumph and fill imperial coffers depleted by civil war and military campaigns. Meanwhile, across Palestine, the remaining strongholds of Jewish resistance prepared for sieges they knew must come, now that Jerusalem had fallen. At Herodium, Machaerus, and Masada, garrisons of survivors who had fled the capital's ruin made desperate preparations to continue a struggle that had already consumed everything they held dear. These fortresses, perched on mountaintops and supplied with cisterns and granaries, offered the possibility of prolonged resistance against imperial assault. Yet the defenders of these final redoubts understood that their situation was hopeless in any conventional military sense. With Jerusalem's fall, the spiritual and political center of Hebrew resistance had been eliminated, leaving isolated pockets of fighters without unified command or realistic prospects for relief. Their continued defiance served purposes that transcended immediate tactical considerations, maintaining the principle that submission to tyranny was worse than death, preserving examples of courage for future generations, and demonstrating that some values could not be compromised regardless of consequences. At Masada, the mountain fortress overlooking the Dead Sea, where Herod had built a palace complex that seemed to hang between earth and heaven, the last remnants of the Sicarii prepared for their final stand. These men and women, drawn from the most radical elements of Hebrew resistance, had witnessed the obliteration of everything they had fought to preserve. Their leader, Eleazar ben Yair understood that Roman determination to eliminate all traces of rebellion would inevitably bring legions to this seemingly impregnable stronghold. The siege of Masada, when it began, demonstrated Roman engineering at its most impressive and ruthless. Against a fortress that could not be approached by conventional means, the legions constructed a massive ramp of stone and earth that rose from the desert floor to the fortress walls, a monument to imperial persistence that required months of labor by thousands of workers. Slaves and prisoners, including many captured Hebrew survivors, were forced to build the very instrument of their people's final defeat. As the great ramp neared completion, an imperial assault became inevitable. The defenders faced choices that would echo through history. Rather than submit to capture and the certain slavery or execution that awaited them, they chose collective suicide, dying by their own hands, rather than providing entertainment for Roman crowds. The discovery of their bodies by legionaries who finally breached the fortress walls provided a sobering conclusion to the Jewish revolt. Here were people who had valued freedom more than life itself. With the fall of Masada in 73 AD, organized Hebrew resistance to imperial rule finally ended after 7 years of warfare that had devastated Palestine and challenged authority in the eastern provinces. The cost of victory had been enormous on both sides. Tens of thousands of legionary casualties, hundreds of thousands of Hebrew deaths, cities demolished, countryside depopulated, and an entire way of life erased from the region where it had flourished for centuries. Vespasian's triumph in the capital, when it finally took place, surpassed all previous celebrations of imperial victory in its scope and magnificence. The procession that wound through the city's streets displayed the captured treasures of Jerusalem's sanctuary: the golden menorah, silver trumpets, sacred vessels, and precious stones that had once adorned the Holy of Holies. Behind these trophies marched thousands of Jewish prisoners, including surviving leaders of the rebellion, destined for execution or slavery as visible proof of imperial dominance. The Arch of Titus, erected to commemorate the victory, depicted scenes from the sacred building's demolition with artistic skill that made marble seem to breathe with life. These relief sculptures, carved by master craftsmen, preserved for posterity the image of legionaries carrying sacred Hebrew objects through imperial streets, a permanent reminder of what befell those who challenged Caesar's authority. The monument stood as both celebration of victory and warning to future rebels across the empire. Economic policies implemented in the aftermath of the revolt demonstrated imperial understanding that mere military conquest was insufficient to prevent future rebellions. The Fiscus Judaicus, a punitive tax imposed on all Jews in the empire, redirected funds that had previously supported the Jerusalem sanctuary toward the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus in the capital. This measure served multiple purposes: generating revenue for imperial coffers, humiliating the conquered population, and symbolically transferring religious devotion from the God of Israel to Caesar's deities. The psychological impact of this tax extended far beyond its financial burden. Every Jewish family, whether they had supported the rebellion or opposed it, now found themselves compelled to fund the very religious system their faith rejected. The annual payment served as a constant reminder of their defeated status, while the proceeds decorated Jupiter's temple with wealth that had been intended for the service of the Almighty. The symbolism was intentional and devastating. Even Hebrew loyalty to their own God now served imperial religious purposes. Across the Mediterranean diaspora, Hebrew communities received news of Jerusalem's ruin with mourning that exceeded even the grief following Babylonian conquest 6 centuries earlier. Then, Exile had been temporary and restoration possible. Prophets had promised return, and Persian tolerance had eventually fulfilled those promises. Now, however, the completeness of imperial victory left no room for hope of restoration. The sanctuary was not merely demolished, but systematically obliterated, its site ploughed under and dedicated to Caesar's deities. Synagogues in the empire became centers of lamentation as communities struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their loss. The sacrificial system that had defined Hebrew worship since Solomon's time could not continue without the sacred complex, forcing religious leaders to develop new forms of observance that could function in exile. Rabbis who had once taught in Jerusalem's academies now found themselves scattered across the known world, carrying with them oral traditions that would need to preserve Hebrew learning without the institutional support it had previously enjoyed. The development of rabbinic Judaism in the decades following the sanctuary's obliteration represented one of history's most remarkable religious adaptations. Scholars like Yohanan ben Zakkai, who had escaped from Jerusalem during the siege and established a new center of learning at Yavne, worked to transform a temple-based faith into something that could survive without its ancient center. This process required fundamental reinterpretations of Scripture, new approaches to religious law, and innovative methods of maintaining community identity across vast geographical distances. Christianity, which had emerged from Hebrew roots in the decades before the Revolt, found itself profoundly affected by Jerusalem's ruin. The city where Jesus had preached and died, where the apostles had established their first communities, now lay in ruins beneath imperial occupation. Christian communities in the empire interpreted this catastrophe through theological lenses that would shape their religion's development for centuries, some seeing divine judgment upon those who had rejected the Messiah, others recognizing the end of an era that required new forms of religious expression. The demographic consequences of the revolt extended across Palestine and beyond. Cities that had supported the rebellion found their populations decimated by warfare, siege, and the systematic executions that followed imperial victory. Countryside that had once supported thriving agricultural communities lay depopulated, its villages abandoned and its fields reverting to wilderness. The economic system that had sustained Hebrew life in Palestine for centuries collapsed, leaving survivors dependent on charity from diaspora communities or subject to exploitation by imperial colonists. Archaeological evidence from excavations in Palestine bears witness to the revolt's devastating impact. Layers of ash and rubble mark the end of Hebrew occupation in dozens of sites, while hordes of coins hidden during the rebellion, but never retrieved, testify to families that perished before they could return for their buried wealth. The material culture that had characterized Hebrew life, distinctive pottery, architecture, religious objects, largely disappeared from the archaeological record, replaced by artifacts that reflect imperial colonial administration. Settlement policies in the decades following the revolt aimed to prevent future rebellions through systematic colonization and cultural transformation. Veterans from the legions that had conquered Palestine received land grants in strategically important locations, creating networks of loyal populations with vested interests in maintaining imperial control. New cities, founded according to classical urban planning, replaced Hebrew communities, their temples, forums, and theaters serving as visible symbols of cultural conquest. The name of the province itself was changed from Judea to Syria Palestina, deliberately invoking the ancient enemies of the Hebrew people and erasing the connection between the land and its former inhabitants. This administrative decision reflected broader policies aimed at eliminating not just political resistance, but cultural memory itself. Maps, official documents, and historical records would refer to Palestine rather than Judea, gradually obscuring the region's Hebrew associations in favor of more ancient and less politically charged identifications. Yet despite the thoroughness of imperial victory and the comprehensive nature of the ruin they had inflicted, the memory of Jerusalem's sanctuary and the sacrifice of its defenders preserved something that military force could not entirely eliminate. In synagogues scattered across the Mediterranean world, prayers continued to face toward the site where the sacred complex had stood, while annual fasts marked the dates of its demolition. These observances maintained connections to the lost homeland that would survive for nearly 2,000 years of exile. The revolt's leaders, many of whom had been executed in imperial amphitheaters or died in the siege of Jerusalem, became figures of legendary status in Hebrew memory. Their willingness to choose death over submission provided examples of courage that would inspire future generations facing persecution and oppression. Stories of their deeds, preserved in oral tradition and eventually recorded in written accounts, kept alive the principle that some things were worth dying to defend. As the survivors of the great catastrophe dispersed in the known world, carrying with them memories of what had been lost and hopes for what might someday be restored, they began the long journey that would define Hebrew existence for the next 19 centuries. The sanctuary lay in ruins, the city was occupied by foreigners, and the land itself bore foreign names. Yet the faith that had sustained them through conquest and exile, that had survived Babylonian captivity and Persian domination, would prove capable of adapting to circumstances that seemed to threaten its very existence. In the capital, where the treasures of Jerusalem's sacred complex decorated pagan shrines, and Hebrew prisoners labored in imperial quarries, Vespasian and Titus celebrated victories that had established their dynasty's claim to lasting power. The Flavian emperors had demonstrated their capacity to maintain order in the empire, crush rebellions that challenged imperial authority, and enrich coffers with the wealth of conquered peoples. Their success in Palestine had validated their right to rule and provided resources for the ambitious building programs that would mark their reigns. But the most lasting monument to the Hebrew revolt would prove to be not the Arch of Titus or the Colosseum, built with proceeds from the sacred treasury, but the transformation of Judaism itself. The religion that emerged from the ashes of Jerusalem would be different from what had existed before, more portable, more intellectual, more capable of maintaining itself without the institutional supports that imperial power had eliminated. This new form of Hebrew faith would carry within it the memory of what had been lost while developing innovations that made survival possible under circumstances that the sanctuary's builders could never have imagined.